Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I am your host, Steve Halley. With me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson of Williams College. Galen, I have a question for you. Do I look tan, more tan than usual?
Yeah, I'll give you the nod on that. Yeah.
All right, that's good
Yeah.
because I watch these videos and I appear to be ghost-like. Usually, it's been winter here in Southern California. I'll tell you why I'm tan. I've been in Orlando, Florida at Disney World on a family vacation.
Yes.
And let me tell you, I am so tired.
You know what, man? I'll have to take your word for it, but I'm not surprised. But also, like, why do you need to go to Florida to tan if you live in Southern California?
Oh, so we have family on the East Coast. We met them there. And yeah, it was out of the ordinary. The kids loved it. I ate so much fried food. I feel the arterial plaque growing.
I think it's worth it, man.
Yeah. So, but I'm back in California, so I'm back to mung beans and kombucha. It's gonna be okay.
You and Creed from The Office.
Exactly. Correct. And that guy lived for quite a while. So anyway, we're doing a quick check-in this week because I'm jet lagged and you got stuff to do. We're checking back in on Iran because there's been, I don't know if you call them developments in the case of Iranian denuclearization, but like stuff is percolating, stuff is happening. We did an episode on Iran, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks ago, where we closed saying, look, Trump is busy with other stuff right now, but he wants to get this done. Probably in the not too distant future, they're going to kick off the talks and we'll get going. It's the not too distant future at this point. Why don't you set the table for us, Galen, in terms of what has happened so far?
Yeah, I would call them developments, but
Yes.
like without trying to spoil it for those who haven't seen it, sort of developments like the finale of this season of The White Lotus.
Mm-hmm.
Uh things that like were semi expected, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen a lot of this before. So basically there was a big article published in the New York Times. Let me look at the date on it.
This is past
Just
week, right?
just a couple days. Yeah, what,
Yeah.
2 days ago?
Right.
Um, basically outlining that there's been an internal debate within the administration on whether to either approve Israeli military action against Iran's nuclear sites, or to, in fact, assist in those military efforts. It's
Mm-hmm.
not totally clear based on the reporting. Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, was at the White House earlier this month, and reportedly this was kind of the key thing he wanted to talk to Trump about. So that's been percolating in the background, and there's been some internal divisions on the topic. For now, the president has decided to engage in negotiations. And somewhat surprisingly, although having seen this movie now, basically the entirety of my like post mid adolescent life,
Last
um,
10 years or so, right?
I'd go back further than that. I mean, like, I remember reading about this when I was in college, So I
Yeah.
like for like 20 years at this point of this basic dynamic. But the question was sort of, would the Iranians come to the agree to talks, which you can understand since they already made a deal with the United States and Trump unilaterally withdrew from it in May 2018.
Right.
So you can understand why the Supreme Leader Khamenei was skeptical that diplomacy with the United States would work in this case. But the reporting indicates that basically some of his advisors, and notably some of his more hawkish advisors, basically said that if they did not pursue diplomacy, there was a high likelihood of either Israeli American or Israeli American military action against
Mm-hmm.
Iran, which could potentially topple the regime in Tehran. So he
Mm-hmm.
has reluctantly agreed for the moment to indirect negotiations. This is something they have feared for quite a while because um, the dirty secret of Iranian politics is the Iranian people don't really like the government very much. And
No. And we've seen that in like big waves of protest in 2018 and 2022. And there's a wave of like really nasty repression every single time. They're still in control, but it's kind of like riding a bucking bronco. Everybody's pissed off. The economy is really bad because of sanctions in part, and we'll get into that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's risk there.
I think if I were going to like try to sum up the basic key factors that will shape these talks, on the one hand, I do think that the Iranians are more afraid that Trump actually will take military action
Mm-hmm.
than, say, Biden or Obama were. Although I think there are credible accounts that in the final analysis, Obama might have been willing to do it if he thought that was the only choice, although we could probably debate that to the end of time. So I do think that has given the Americans somewhat more leverage, that these threats appear more credible to Tehran. On the other hand, because Trump withdrew from the deal in 2018, the United States is in a much worse position than it was in 2013 to 2015 during the lead up to the first Iran agreement, because Iran has enriched to a much higher level. It has a much larger stockpile of 60% enriched uranium.
Mm-hmm.
And importantly, the rest of the world is much less on board or aligned with the United States, not only because Trump withdrew from the first deal, which the rest of the world was on board with, but also just given more recent actions more broadly with American foreign policy. So there's kind of a push and pull there, and I
Yeah,
guess
I
that's
think
what the
that's right.
negotiations are all about.
So let's set the table in terms of the Iranian side, kind of their assets and I guess you could call them liabilities at the outset of negotiations here.
Definitely.
They've been under so the two things to really talk about are what the maximum pressure campaign has done to them economically, like what it is and how bad things are over there. Because they are looking for sanctions relief. There's no question about that. Number one. Number two, what sort of military assets do they have? And what sort of threats can they make to deter military action? And do the Israelis and Americans consider those threats credible? So
Yeah.
let's start with sanctions. What's going on with sanctions?
Yeah. How about I do the sanctions, you do the military stuff?
That sounds good.
All right.
Yeah.
There's no question that the sanctions have taken a real toll on the Iranian economy, and that they have affected, everyday Iranians in a very direct way.
Mm-hmm.
The first round, very effective sanctions during the Obama presidency, were quite effective for a few reasons. They were multilateral.
Right.
So the key European players were on board. Russia and China, passed these sanctions at the UN Security Council. And that really put the Iranians in a bind. I'll have to check this, but I believe in 2012, Iran was more or less cut off from the SWIFT messaging system, which is one of the more like niche and in the weeds things that's really important. It's essentially the international messaging system that banks use. And if you're cut off from it, it becomes very difficult to be involved in international finance. This all led to really steep declines in Iranian oil exports. I have to check the figures, but I think like the Iranian currency was devalued something like 40 to 60%.
Brutal.
You could see real effects on even things like on medicine.
Yeah.
And so it had a major effect. Now, you might think those were multilateral. They were more effective than the Trump sanctions when he withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018 and implemented his so-called maximum pressure policy. The thing is, the United States is uniquely privileged, at least for the moment, when it comes to using economic warfare, because it can use what are called secondary sanctions.
Right.
Which basically is the United States telling other countries, we're not only sanctioning the Iranians, we're sanctioning anyone who does business with the Iranians.
And this is relatively new. I think it was developed as a tool of statecraft in the Obama administration, if I'm remembering correctly.
I'll have to check the origin. I can't remember if that's certainly when it like took off. I mean, a
Yeah,
lot.
it was used a lot more. And the thing is, like, this is super powerful, and it does seem to work. It keeps other countries from wanting to do business with you. The thing is, though, the more you use it, the more other countries want to find ways around it and develop alternatives. And there's a lot of evidence that's been
Yes.
happening. That's not a topic for this show, but it is interesting and important for
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, like this is what I'm saying. Swift is like super kind of in the weeds, but like these are really important mechanisms of American economic statecraft
Yeah.
that have been leveraged more and more, really post 9/11.
Mm.
But basically, what these secondary sanctions do is it puts, for example, countries in Europe in this tough position of you can either do business with the Iranians or you can do business with the United States.
Easy choice, or it has
Very,
been.
yes, and we'll see.
Yeah.
But historically, a very easy choice. Now, the Iranians have been able to do some things like have shadow tanker fleets that allow
Ghost
them,
fleets. Yep.
yeah, that allow them to export oil to China. China's only too happy to import, just as they have been from Russia during the Ukraine war when it was subjected to sanctions, oil at discounted rates.
Yep.
But nevertheless, I think Iranian oil production or exports have declined by something like 50%.
I think, yeah, 50 to, I mean, depending on the year, 50 to 75%. So ordinarily, Iran is a 4 million barrel a day exporter,
Yeah.
which would put it in the top 10. It's not one of the biggest, but it's like a pretty important supplier. And that's crashed to between 1 million and 1.5 million a day. And that is a major source of foreign exchange. It's resulted in 40% inflation of the Iranian rial. It's resulted in a, depending on who you ask, 10 to 20% contraction in the Iranian economy. Typical rule of thumb is, 5% is a recession, 10% or more is a depression. Yeah, it's quite bad, and Iranians are not happy about this at all. That's why the supreme leader, looking maybe for sanctions relief, allowed Pezeshkian to become the new president of Iran. He is supposedly a moderate, and
A relative moderate, yeah.
low bar in Iran as these things go. But yeah, he's a guy who is there to maybe make some kind of deal. And so that's where things stand with Iranian sanctions. It's hurt them really bad.
Yes, I'm looking at some charts on this now, and it's like the sanctions when they went into effect in 2012 looks like, a 40% decline in GDP. And then after the Trump sanctions are implemented, like maybe a 50% decline, like really heavy stuff. And just this is a little in the weeds, but since you mentioned Khamenei allowing Pezeshkian to become president, Iran does have elections for president, but we have seen past instances where the higher ups like Khamenei are fine rigging the result.
You do it routinely. However, that being said, Iran has been and remains one of the more democratic states in the Middle East, which I think a lot of people don't realize.
It depends. Look, like, yes, it has elections for president. And I think the last time they overturned the results was the 2009 election when they threw it to Ahmadinejad over Mousavi. Yep. But at the end of the day, just so everyone knows, like the supreme leader has the final say, and he does. He is unelected.
Yeah. The point is, though, that's the final say, not necessarily the first say. And, other places in the Middle East, it's like the supreme leader has the first say. You just go straight there. Anyway, all right. So that's the sort of economic situation. This is why the Iranians are actually interested in making a deal. It's because they're suffering legitimately, and they have been for a while. On the other side of the ledger, let's talk about their sort of military position and their military assets. Now, in the last show, we mentioned that Israel had really just kicked the crap out of Iran's proxy militias in the area. Iran is well known for extending power through these non-state actors, I guess you could call them, in the area. You have Hezbollah in Lebanon. You have Hamas in Israel and Palestine. You've got the Houthis in Yemen. You have a grab bag of militias in Iraq. And then you used to have some assets in Syria, too. I mean, they were The Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad was a major asset.
Yeah.
That guy's no longer a going concern.
That was a big hit to them, him getting
Huge,
taken out.
huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that dude's chilling in like Moscow
Yeah.
or some place that's not
Yeah.
Syria. The new Syrian regime is, I think, Sunni fundamentalist. So that's no good
Well,
for them.
we're gonna find out.
Yeah, hard to say exactly where those guys stand.
We do one on Syria at some point, but
yeah. Once some more evidence is in, Israel kicked the crap out of Hezbollah, famously with exploding cell phones that took out basically their entire management layer. We know what has been done to Hamas after what Hamas did to Israel. Hamas is still around, but in terms of capability, not a lot left comparatively. The Houthis are currently being bombed by the United States, so they're being suppressed, I would say. Actually getting rid of the Houthis is probably impossible, but they're being suppressed at a minimum. I know less about what has happened in Iraq with those Iraqi militias.
I'd say Iraq is where the Iranians probably have the most leverage.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, look, I don't want to get carried away with it, but like there is now a very strong countervailing anti-Iranian sentiment among Iraqis because Iran just has largely turned Iraq into a vassal state. But Iran has all sorts of proxy allies in the area. It's deeply involved in Iraqi politics, and the United States obviously has a much smaller footprint than it did there 2 decades ago. So if I was going to pick a place where they remain the strongest, it would probably be in Iraq.
Right. And they give these militias rockets and so on to shoot. Now, in terms of direct capabilities, Iran's sort of conventional forces, its army, navy, air force, are weak. They cannot accomplish very much. They're relying on military hardware from quite a while ago, basically the 70s when the Shah was still in power and the U.S. and Iran were still allies.
Yeah.
They don't have spare parts for any of that stuff. So instead, they have a gigantic stockpile of missiles, rockets, and drones now. And they've employed these to strike at Israel twice, I think last year, right?
Correct. April and October.
And this was as a result of Israel doing what it did to the leadership of Hezbollah. Those guys have been getting got.
Yes. So, but the October 1st assault was in response to the Nasrallah assassination.
Okay, got it. So the first barrage, 300 missiles, rockets, and drones in April, and then another 150 to 200 in October. And it took the Israelis, the Americans, the Jordanians, the British, and I'm not sure who else, but it took a lot of different countries working together to shoot all that stuff down, which they successfully did.
And noteworthy that you had Arab states on board for that, I would say.
Yeah, that says something right there. The Jordanians and Israelis are kind of like undeclared allies, basically, at this stage in the game. So Israel managed to protect itself with a little help from its friends, but like this was not nothing. This was a demonstration of capability. And my understanding is that Iran is still sitting on 3,000 drones, SRBMs, and IRBMs. That's short-range ballistic missiles, intermediate-range ballistic missiles, a lot of which can hit Israel if Israel, didn't have air defenses, which it does, right?
Yeah.
Now, the Israelis really don't like this, so they took some measures against Iran. They struck Iran's own air defense forces, taking out those S-300 Russian batteries that are generally pretty good. And the Russia's busy, so Iran probably can't really get any more. This is led Iran to be vulnerable to follow-up strikes. Israel also blew up the liquid rocket fuel mixing facility.
I think about a dozen of them.
Okay, several. And a lot of these rockets are liquid fueled, especially the older ones that are based on the Scud missiles that you might remember from Gulf War I. Yeah, that's a deep cut.
Or the 1973 war, the Egyptians reportedly fired one during that war. Yeah.
That's an old Soviet design.
Yes, very old.
Very old. Yeah, based on the V2 or V1. I'm not sure.
That I would have to check. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Basically, Israel struck at Iran directly after being struck by Iran. But Iran maintains a lot of strike capability with these missiles and rockets. They even have hypersonic missiles, apparently. I don't know if those were used in these strikes.
I don't think so. And it's worth noting to me, I think it was October 1st was the second one. That one
Yeah.
to me is the more significant one because the one almost exactly a year ago, the April attack, they telegraphed that one.
Yeah.
They basically put the Israelis and the United States on notice like about 72 hours in advance.
Move all your stuff. Yeah.
And
Like get
it was
underground.
largely slow moving like drone tech. Like it seemed more symbolic
Hmm.
because at that point it was, the Israelis were wreaking havoc on their proxy system and there was increasing pressure on them to have to do something. And it was more symbolic than anything. The October one, as we'll talk about, it's not like they let forth their full assault. It was like 180 ballistic missiles, but
Right.
I think they were expecting that one to actually get some stuff.
Right.
And I think a few missiles got to one Israeli base,
Mm.
but I don't believe there were any casualties. That one I think was more alarming for them because I think that was more of a real swing.
It was a real swing. So if they start using the hypersonic missiles, that's technology that is much more difficult to intercept. And if their stuff actually works, that could be pretty dangerous for the Israelis, even without nuclear warheads, just
Yeah.
conventional. Yeah, that could cause a lot of problems. So they're
I
holding
mean,
that in
you,
reserve.
you could, by the way, put chemical weapons on those if you wanted
Sure,
to. So, yeah.
sure. All of this to say, Iran does retain some capability. I think Hezbollah probably retains some capability too. It's not completely shut down. It's just not as strong as it used to be.
Yeah, but not nearly as strong. I
Not
actually
nearly
think
as strong.
that's the single biggest shift I would say for the Iranians is that was
Yeah.
supposed to be their ace in the hole. And
The ace got torn up in little pieces.
yeah,
Okay. Hezbollah is probably sitting out this next round then. Yeah, but like I guess what I'm getting at is the question whether you think Iran's capability should be discounted at this point, or if they retain enough capability for it to be an actual deterrent to the Israelis and the United States.
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Um, I think as we've talked about with Trump before, there's like this push and pull where he is fine taking a hard line, but at the end of the day, I think the last thing he wants is a war in the Middle East.
Yeah, I agree with
Um,
that.
and while I think there's reasons one could argue to believe that that war might go pretty well, war is extremely unpredictable.
It's
And
risky. You're taking risks.
and if you look at how disastrous the Iraq war was, Iran is a much larger country.
Hmm.
Um, I would argue it has substantially better capabilities.
Hmm.
So I almost don't necessarily think it's any of these specific military assets we're talking about, although some of these missiles, if they got through, I think could do some damage to the
Hmm.
Israelis if the Iranians really went for it. I think it's more of a holistic calculation
Hmm.
that it would be you would be putting Khamenei in an impossible position. Like he would have to retaliate if it was a full scale attack
Yeah.
on
Yep.
Iran's facilities. The war plans that were talked about in that New York Times article I mentioned were Israeli commando raids
Hmm.
into some of the underground facilities combined with airstrikes. We're talking like a major set of military operations.
We're talking about the Dirty Dozen type shit, right?
Yeah,
Basically,
so
you're carrying
I
in dynamite.
I think at that point, like Iran is ready to play, so to speak. And I think
Yeah.
that's the bigger calculation than anything specific about, hey, the Houthis could do this or Hezbollah might be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and
That's right.
the other piece that's important here when it comes to the negotiations, um, although I think there's still a lot we don't know, is like is the fact that Trump is taking a much friendlier line toward the Russians, as we've talked about in the past, going to shape Iranian behavior?
Yeah, that's a good question. Apparently, the Iranian negotiating team actually went to Moscow to talk to the Russians to kind of take their temperature on what support they could expect from the Russians out of this. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the negotiations themselves. So, Trump has dispatched Steve Witkoff.
His boy.
Yeah, he's another real estate developer. He's as a special envoy to the Middle East. Now, this guy Witkoff, yeah, he's supposedly focused on the Middle East, but he's also been talking to the Russians about Ukraine, apparently.
Yeah. Yes.
So he's kind of like a roving diplomat sans portfolio, I guess.
And putting it.
Yeah, he's like Trump's proxy. We've had one round of talks that apparently went at least okay. Like, enough.
They were polite.
Yes, okay enough for another round of talks
to
happen. The Israelis are watching this, and they kind of don't like what they're seeing at all, because the Israelis want to take this opportunity to end the Iranian threat that has been hanging over them for like damn near 50 years at this point.
Yeah.
But the Israelis are not in the driver's seat. As we talked about in our last episode, it's going to be really tough for them to be sure that any sort of Israeli strike on Iran will succeed in disarming the Iranians and ending that nuclear program without American bunker buster bombs. Now, the Americans have dispatched B-2 bombers to Diego Garcia, which is a military base in the Indian Ocean. The B-2s carry the bunker busters. This is an overt threat. In addition, there are now two carrier groups in the area, the Carl Vinson and the Harry S. Truman, two of our more advanced carriers.
It's a lot of military assets to deploy to one spot.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
And noting, I think the entire U.S. B-2 bomber force totals 21.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are typically somewhere in the Midwest, like undergoing maintenance or training operations.
These are delicate machines. Let's note that that's 21 more than most countries have.
Correct. The point is, I think there's 6 of them at Diego Garcia at the moment. Yeah. So like 30% of the entire B-2 force.
Yeah. Enough to do the mission,
yes.
Basically. Yeah. The Iranians know this, and they're scared shitless, I think. The carriers are pounding the crap out of Yemen right now, but they could just as easily pound the crap out of Tehran, on a moment's notice, basically. So yeah, we have these negotiations at the point of a gun. It's basically the point that we're making. The Israelis want to shoot the gun, like irrespective of whatever the deal the Americans get. They're not interested. They've been very clear about that, but they can't do it themselves. They might try anyway.
And this was, look, to reiterate that this is not new. Like, this was a big story at the very end of the George W. Bush administration, when there was a debate over whether to provide this technology to the Israelis. Bush decided not to. 2010 to 2012, it was very clear the Israelis were trying to box in the Obama administration to get them to take action on this. And the pressure there was especially high because the Israelis recognized that their window of opportunity was probably closing to be able to do it themselves. And Israel was probably the country that was most upset by the signing of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Netanyahu famously tore it apart at the UN General Assembly.
Wow. Yeah. Khrushchev type stuff, huh?
Yeah.
And so he's even more upset now that Trump might sign another deal. Let's talk about the contours of that deal. My understanding is there's kind of two broad sets of sticking points. One is the degree to which Iran is allowed to enrich uranium. Now, the Iranians have professed willingness in various regime outlets and owned newspapers and stuff like that to go back down to 4% enrichment, which would be sufficient for civilian power generation, insufficient for nuclear weapons. This is down from 60%, which is a hop, skip, and a jump to 90%, which is when stuff starts blowing up. So they would be cool with that. the Israelis have said, no, we want you at 0%. We want a Libya type deal. Can you explain what that means?
So the Libya deal, first of all, just on the 60% thing, there's not really any usage for 60% enriched uranium.
Other than to go to 90%.
Yeah, like 20% is, there's some medical applications potentially. 60%, there's no reason to do it unless you're eventually trying to get a bomb.
Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot what you just asked me.
I was asking you, like, what the Israelis mean by a Libya type.
Oh, yeah. So I think it was December, either 2003 or 2004. The then president of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, who is no longer with us. And by
he
the
died
way,
in a ditch.
Yes. And by the way, this is often held up by countries like North Korea as, oh, you want us to give up our nuclear program?
Yeah.
Look what happens if you do that. Now, for a few things, the Libyan program, not nearly as far along as the Iranian program, like run in a completely piss poor fashion. The technology, which they largely got from the Pakistanis, was kind of the P1 centrifuges, the not terribly effective ones. But what the Israelis mean when they say that is a complete dismantling of the program.
That's right. No nukes for you, including reactors, right?
Yes.
Including research.
Now, look, the Iranians, whatever you think of the importance of international law, which we would have to have like the whole day of an episode to talk about that. The Iranians are a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which guarantees them the right to peaceful nuclear energy program. Now, they have to be under IAEA inspections to be in compliance with their obligations. But their argument is, no, we do not have to dismantle our reactors and completely get rid of our nuclear program. We have every right to have a peaceful nuclear program. The Israelis are not okay with that for the same reason that they weren't okay with it in 2015, which is here we are 10 years later. And this is dual use technology. Any nuclear technology that can be used to produce nuclear energy can also be used to create nuclear weapons.
Yes, that's right. But what they want, at least right now, doesn't matter. We've said this many times. I'm going to say it again. What matters is what the big guy wants.
Yeah.
The president. What does the president want?
Well, look, it's not totally clear.
And that's one of the problems, right?
Yeah. So if you look at the JCPOA, the deal that Obama negotiated, which he called the quote was something like one of the worst deals ever, ever, ever.
Yes.
And it was a complete disaster and all the rest. That deal basically said, okay, we will give you sanctions relief. In exchange, you will only enrich uranium to about 3 or 4%. You'll ship out your stockpile of enriched uranium, I think, to the Russians. There's intrusive inspections. So that was essentially the deal, but it did not cover Iran's ballistic missile program. And typically, if you have a ballistic missile program, you're looking to mate nuclear warheads to it. So that was a criticism. The fact that there were sunset provisions in the agreement, that it was only supposed to last for different clauses 10 to 15 years, that was a criticism. The fact that it did not address Iran's broader behavior in the region was a criticism of the deal, and that by lifting the sanctions, you would be giving them this windfall, and that money could get funneled to Hezbollah and all the other proxies we just talked about. It seems like Trump is probably going to be negotiating a deal that looks a lot like that. I find it implausible. I mean, look, I'll eat my words if this turns out to be the case, but that the Iranians would dismantle their entire nuclear program.
They're not going to go to 0%. They'll go to 4%.
Yeah.
So they'll go back to where they were under the JCPOA. They've said that they would. And it makes sense given the facts on the ground, but I think you're right. They're not going to do Libya.
And so, and I could be wrong, but like having followed those negotiations over the JCPOA very closely, it's not as if the Obama people didn't try to get that other stuff.
Right.
Okay. Like the ballistic missile thing was a huge point of emphasis.
Yeah.
And the Iranians didn't go along with it.
Yeah.
So like, I kind of think that the agreement is going to look like the JCPOA, maybe marginally worse from a U.S. standpoint. And I think Trump will probably say, this is the most beautiful deal I've ever seen and declare victory.
Yeah. So that's interesting. This will obviously be unacceptable to the Israelis,
Yeah.
but they'll have to accept it, at least for now, because if we have a deal, meaning the Americans have a deal with the Iranians, we will not give the Israelis the bunker busters they need. We will not use those B-2s or the carrier groups. Doesn't mean that the Israelis can't still attack Iran,
Yeah.
but they might not be able to finish the job unless they do super risky stuff like commando raids.
Yeah. And, what we've seen for the last 15 years or so is much more, I'm not going to say these aren't important, but much more modest than compared to a full airstrike. Things like assassinating Iranian nuclear scientists.
Yeah.
The Stuxnet cyber operation that sabotaged it, various other forms of sabotage. I just have a hard time believing that if in the final analysis, the Iranians say, okay, look, we're willing to basically do, JCPOA 2.0, take it or leave it. I have a hard time thinking Trump at that point then says, okay, like we're doing the military option.
Why? Why is that? Why do you think that is? Even though he's now spent 10 years complaining about, well, more than 10 years complaining about the JCPOA. Why would
Yeah.
he accept something worse now?
Well, I should say, by the way, you mentioned Witkoff.
Yeah.
He at first said he really made a concession publicly and said it looked like, the U.S. wasn't looking for a total dismantling of Iran's program.
He said 4% would be acceptable.
Yeah. He reversed himself on that.
Yeah.
I guess for a few reasons. The main one is I just think finds the idea of a war in the Middle East completely unacceptable.
It would be tough given that the tariffs are already going to cause inflation.
Yeah.
If energy prices go way up, because one thing the Iranians could do, I think pretty reliably, is drive energy prices up by attacking refineries and oil fields in the area. They wouldn't just have to attack Israel.
Well, and if their oil gets taken off the world market as well, which might happen in the context of a larger conflict.
So that's a plausible threat. They could attack Saudi Arabia. They have in the past. They could attack the Emirates. And it's going to be tough for the United States to cover all that ground with missile defense. Like they can't do it.
I don't want to make it seem like the Iranians are 10 feet tall.
Oh.
They've obviously had a very rough year and a half here. But I think the possibility of a major conflict, if you were going to ask me, other than, I guess, kind of what he's doing, tanking the thing that would be the single most unpopular thing you could do with American voters, it would be to start another large-scale conflict in the Middle East.
That's a great point. And Trump has been sensitive to trying to fulfill his campaign promises, bring the troops home, not start new foreign adventures, wrap up all these other wars we're involved in tangentially as quickly as possible, not caring that much about the terms of the deal, for the people involved.
He did back away. Remember the 2019 Iranian drone tax on Saudi Arabia?
Mm-hmm.
He famously didn't retaliate. I mean, two other things, one, it's one thing to have a campaign position, and then when you're actually sitting in the seat, things look very differently. And, I seem to remember journalists at the New York Times asking him specifically, hey, which parts of the JCPOA do you not like? And he was like, so I think once you're actually doing the negotiating, things are more difficult. And the second piece is, I actually think he's in a better position politically to deal with Israeli objections to this. We already talked about how the Israelis lack the capabilities on their own probably to do this. But if the Israelis try to turn this against him, I think they're actually going to have a hard time doing that for a variety of reasons related to key constituencies like evangelicals in the United States that think he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. He's done a huge amount for Israel. So
more than any other president.
Yeah. Arguably. So I think he's more insulated to those types of criticisms.
Yeah, Netanyahu doesn't have a ton of leverage on him. Doesn't seem like it.
Yeah.
So he might just have to eat this and take what he can get. Look, the Israelis can still kick the crap out of all the Iranian assets in their area, and I expect that they will. I mean, they've started attacking Gaza again. We can get back to that at some point in the future. Not right now, please. But okay, so you kind of think that Trump is going to declare victory and go home in relatively short order, kind of like what is seemingly about to happen in Ukraine. And this kind of makes sense given what we know about his priorities, which do not lie in the foreign realm, to put it mildly. They lie at home.
And by the way, like, while I would find it somewhat annoying that after trashing this for 7 years, he then turns around and basically does the same thing, and I imagine we'll get a lot of credit for it. I find that not necessarily a bad outcome. Like, look, I was not one of the people that was like wholeheartedly enthusiastic about the JCPOA. Anyone that tries to tell you from a U.S. standpoint that it was a perfect deal is not correct.
Wrong. Yeah.
There were parts of it that were deeply imperfect, but like, it bought you time. And, you know, 10 to 15 years, a lot can happen. And if the alternatives is war, a potentially pretty devastating one, I think it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world.
Listen, I know you have a hard out in 3 minutes.
Yeah,
I want to know what book that is. There's a book on your desk.
This one.
We always forget to do book corner. Not this time.
So I'm reading, this is a pretty niche one. The Cybersecurity Dilemma by Ben Buchanan, who worked in the Biden administration, and I think now is at Johns Hopkins. I'll have to check that.
SICE.
Yeah. So basically, anyone that has studied international relations is familiar with this concept, this security dilemma, which is basically, even if you have sort of defensive-minded motivations, actions you take for defense can look very threatening to someone else. And basically, this is a book about how that dilemma is really on steroids in cyberspace for a variety of reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. Does that just come down to not so much the tools, but the people being able to defend and attack?
There's like a few, I mean, a lot of it has to do with basically the covert nature of this. So like, if you want to intrude into another state's networks for defensive intelligence collection, it's impossible to distinguish those from, whereas something like landmines, pretty clearly a defensive weapon.
Well, that all depends where you put them, doesn't it?
All right, fair enough. So there's never any such thing as a purely offensive or defensive weapon, but you can, in physical space, you can try to mitigate it. Much more difficult to do in the digital space.
Interesting. Okay.
You're reading anything?
Yeah, I read Careless People, which actually has a substantial IR component.
Oh, really?
It does. So it's by this woman, Sarah Wynne Williams, who was an early employee of Facebook. She created the position of basically international diplomacy or international diplomat within Facebook at a time where nobody at Facebook knew or cared how governments would eventually come to look at Facebook as a major non-state actor on a par with a lot of states in terms of the amount of power that it actually can project through manipulation of people's emotions and information, right? So she was there from the beginning, working with Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. Yeah. And she basically doesn't have anything good to say about these people. Like, it's, you know, she presents herself as somebody, and look, there's two sides to every story, at least, right? This is her side. She got canned in 2017, so this is not terribly current, but she basically makes it sound like they never gave a crap about their effects on government or the international environment until it became clear that, like, they had power. And then once that happened, they tried to figure out how to monetize it. And they were mostly interested in just making as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, and did not care about the externalities like Cambridge Analytica, for instance, in the United States.
I read that, I think it was called An Ugly Truth, which was also about Facebook. But yeah, that was basically the same. Anytime it came down to like ethics and profit,
Yeah.
they chose profit.
Yeah. No, and like Mark, is basically depicted as this guy who's like an engineer, and he doesn't like give a fuck about people, like individually or in groups or states or anything, unless they're like messing with his bottom line. You know?
Well, to be fair, he did get his start creating a website ranking how good looking people at Harvard were. So
Totally. Yeah. And she talks about that. And also a lot of the scandalous stuff that went in within Facebook, and some of which amounted to harassment. And yeah, not a good look for Facebook. Now Meta. So
all right,
interesting.
what a place to leave it.
Yeah. All right. Till next time, everybody. Thanks, Galen.
Yep, you too, Steve.